Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. Pope Francis passed away at the age of 88 on April 21st, 2025, the Monday after Easter Sunday. By the time this episode airs, Francis will already have been laid to rest, and the world may already know who the next pontiff is. Yet it's important to pause and reflect on Francis's legacy. The first pope from Latin America, the first Jesuit pope, and the first pope to take the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi. What stood out in Pope Francis's 12-year pontificate? How did his Jesuit and South American roots influence his priorities for the Church? How does his papacy compare with those of his immediate predecessors, Pope Benedict XVI and Pope St. John Paul II? How do popular impressions about Francis, especially those generated by secular media, compare with Francis's actual teachings and record? And what should we continue to champion from Francis's legacy as the Church charts her course into the future? Here to discuss Pope Francis's influence on both the Church and the world, and to share his own personal experiences meeting with the Pontiff, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks, Matt. Always good to be with you.
Today we're looking at the legacy of Pope Francis, how he's affected the Church and how he's affected the world. But before we actually get into the content of the show, you've actually been very busy lately honoring that legacy.
Yeah.
So what have you been up to?
As we record these words, the Pope died just a few days ago. And so the very day he died, I was on radio and television pretty much the entire day doing interviews. And I've written a couple things assessing the legacy of Francis. So, it's a good time for that kind of retrospective look at his life. And so that's what I've been up to a lot, as well as trying to run this diocese.
You gave a mass yesterday, right?
I did indeed, yeah. Last night, as we record these words, I had a mass here at our co-cathedral in Rochester in honor of the Pope and praying for the Pope. I told the people, I said, every time you met with the Pope, either individually or as a group, he would always say, pray for me. And then he'd say, I mean it, pray for me. So I told the people, hear those words tonight, is let's continue to pray for the Pope.
That's a great bridge to the first question that we have.
Yeah.
We're going to look at some of the theological dimensions of his papacy and also look at some of his background. But you actually got to meet the Pope on several occasions. What were those encounters like?
They were all good. The first time I met him was at what we call Baby Bishop School. When every year in September, usually the bishops named that year gather in Rome for a series of lectures and talks. At the end of it, we meet the Pope. And so he was very generous, with his time. He shook hands with everybody. So toward the end of it, I came up to him with my two brother bishops from Los Angeles at the time. And we were called the triplets. He called us that to Archbishop Gomez. Oh, you're triplets, And so when the first, Joe Brennan, now the Bishop of Fresno, came up to the Pope, he said, I'm one of the triplets of Archbishop Gomez. And the Pope just lit up, and where are the other two? And then we came up, and I really treasure this picture I have back in my house of the three of us. We're all kind of beaming, and I'm shaking hands with the Pope. So that's the first time I met him. And, he knew from the beginning this work I do in media. Because when he saw me, he goes, the one who makes the airwaves tremble, or something like that, And then every subsequent time that I would see him, we weren't intimate friends, but I'd run into him at these different events. He always acknowledged that he knew the work I was doing in preaching and evangelizing. So he was very warm, very generous, gregarious, usually had a joke or a smile of some type. I would speak to him in Spanish, typically. One time, I have this picture in my house. I came up to him, and he just started speaking to me rapidly in Italian. And he's gesturing like this, and I had no idea what he was saying. Before I had the presence of mind to say, like, en español, por favor, santo padre, it was over. You meet the Pope, and things move on. So there's this picture, and there I am smiling, and he's like this, smiling, and he's talking to me. So everyone says, what did he say? And I say, I don't know. But the other times we spoke in Spanish, and he was delightful and easy to talk to, and
It's also important to recognize before we get into his actual legacy, the circumstances that led to his papacy. Pope Benedict XVI
super unusual.
Yeah, so say a little bit about that. What kind of impact did you notice on the Church having two? I know Benedict was not Pope, but
right,
having both of them alive at the same time, oftentimes in proximity to each other.
Right, and it was certainly peculiar. I remember the morning, I woke up and my cell phone just lit up with messages because the Pope had resigned, and no one was expecting that. And it set up a completely unique situation. It hadn't happened in 600 years, and so no one really knew what to do. I remember questions about what do we call former Pope Benedict, and will he be Cardinal Ratzinger again, and will he live in Rome? Will he go back to Germany? What would he wear? Would he wear a black cassock like a cardinal? So that people had all those questions, and they settled eventually on Pope Emeritus, which was a peculiar new title. He decided to live in the Vatican, dressed as the Pope, except I think for the white mozzetta. He didn't wear that.
Yeah.
Look, I'd agree with some people that say it did set up a certain confusion or ambiguity, and probably to some degree, Benedict, not willing to do so, but gathered around him a certain opposition to Francis. So, I mean, going forward, is that situation the best? That the emeritus Pope would live right at the Vatican dressing as the Pope? I don't know. We could debate that maybe. Let's say a Pope does resign in the future. Would it be better for that Pope to go back to his home country, to revert to becoming cardinal again? I mean, I don't know. We can debate that. I think generally they got along famously, and I think Benedict was very good not interfering with Francis. I think he did, for the most part, retire into prayer and study, and he did some writing, which has come out since he's died. So I think generally it worked out fine, though there might have been some ambiguity about it.
So even before Pope Francis did or said anything, he was a Pope of three firsts. So he's the first Pope to be from the Americas, Latin America in particular, the first Jesuit to be elected Pope, and also the first Pope to take the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi. So let's look at each one of those in turn and get some analysis. So Bishop, what ways did you see Pope Francis's Latin American roots at work in his papacy? Was that detectable at all to you?
Well, I think so. I mean, culturally, ethnically, he's very Italian.
Right.
He grew up indeed speaking Italian as well as Spanish. And he had very close kind of ties to Italy. So, ethnically, Hispanic and Italian, kind of a combination, I suppose. Culturally, yeah. I mean, when you're formed in Latin America, there's a certain view of economy and of politics. I think it's hard to miss a certain anti-Americanism in Francis, and that probably came from a Latin American formation, a tendency to see, the Yankees up north as kind of a source of mischief economically and dominant politically. I think that certainly influenced him. In fact, he was a non-European, a Westerner, an American. The Vatican people would say they tend to see North and South America as both the New World, America. Sure, I think it would give him a distinctive perspective on things. But my guess is that the Jesuit formation was even more important than his Latin American formation.
Let's say more about that. Where did you see his Ignatian roots at work?
I think everywhere. I mean, I propose that maybe that's the hermeneutical key to Francis, that he was an Ignatian, he was a Jesuit. So formed in the spiritual exercises, a spirituality of detachment, whether I have a long life or short life, whether I'm rich or poor, a detachment from the goods of the world, a life of voluntary poverty. I think he put that on display in his own life, and he wanted that for the church. Secondly, the great stress on prayer. He was a man of deep prayer. They say he rose about 4 o'clock or 4:30 every morning, spent a couple hours in prayer. That's a very Ignatian thing to do. Also, maybe we'll touch on it more later, but synodality is very much of a Jesuit kind of mentality, discernment of God's will. That's at the heart of the exercises. When you start, especially as a 30-day exercise with Ignatius, the idea is, okay, what does God want? What does God want from my life? And then you, by careful exercises, you discern that. You listen to the voice of God. You learn how to discern. What are signs of God's presence? What are the desolations and consolations involved? And all of that. I think in many ways, if synodality is his great legacy to the church, it was a universalization of the Ignatian, approach. Now, we can say good to some degree. I always remember this friend of mine who's formed as a Dominican, and he once said to me, I think we could use a little less Jesuit discernment and some more Dominican truth. That there's anything you do has a shadow side. And discern,
Yeah,
listen,
right.
listen. Well, how long, Now, to be fair to Ignatius, the point of the exercise is to come to a decision. It's not just to be an endless, discernment. You're meant to come to a decision.
Right.
Was that happening in the synodal process? That's a question I have, having participated in it pretty intimately. I was there for the 2 rounds of the synod on synodality, and that's the question I have, is did we move sufficiently toward real resolution?
Or did it get stuck in the process? Right?
Yeah, that's the question I would have about it.
And what do we make of the Jesuit Francis choosing the name Francis?
Well, I remember I was over there 12 years ago doing commentary, and when the name, he's Francis the First. We were calling him at the time Francis the First. And people said, oh, is it Francis of Assisi or is it Francis Xavier, the great Jesuit?
Yeah.
And so I remember saying, well, I don't know, why not both? And he is a Jesuit, and he talks about the church going on mission, and Francis Xavier is the great missionary. Well, eventually he clarified, no, it's Francis of Assisi.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. But, he had the Jesuit discernment spirit, but also that missionary spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that brought him in line with Vatican II, with John Paul II, new evangelization. I think that Ignatian missionary impulse was very deep in Francis.
Let's now look at some of Pope Francis's distinctive theological and moral priorities and his style of church governance. So, Bishop, on several occasions, you've described Pope Francis as a master of what you've called the beau geste.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we often comment John Paul II was an actor and had a sense of theatricality about him. I think Francis did too. He wasn't trained as an actor, but he had a sense of beau geste, the kind of beautiful gesture that expresses the Christian faith maybe better than 10,000 words would do it. You think of the embrace of that man who was severely disfigured. It was early in his papacy. You think of the paying his bill at the simple clerical residence. I know where that place is, and indeed it is a very simple residence. He didn't live in Vatican splendor. He could have, but he chose to live there. He knew that on the world stage, some of these things, or one of my favorite stories, because I was there in 2015 when he came to America. His only visit to America, and I had just been named a bishop, and I was standing with all my brother bishops on the front steps of St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, and we're waiting for the Pope to arrive, right? And one after another, these big stretch limousines come up, big cars, black, shining limousines, and presidents and prime ministers getting out, and Congress leaders and cultural figures. I mean, a lot of limousines. And then comes this little putt-putt, this little car, this little Fiat, I think it was, and out pops the Pope. And it was so incongruous that we all laughed. Everyone broke out in laughter, and he laughed. He kind of looked up and laughed at it. And that was a beau geste. It was a way of saying, okay, I'm not arriving in a limousine. I'm arriving in this simple car. And you could say, okay, it was very self-conscious. Maybe it was, but it was a way of trying to express symbolically what he wanted expressed.
Yeah, and that moment of comedy as well, right?
Yeah. Oh, he was very funny, and usually with an edge. My Spanish is not good enough to catch all of his nuances. You'd be able to do that. But everyone that dealt with him that I ever talked to said he usually had a little jab or a little edgy comment or a little sarcastic remark. Not mean-spirited, but edgy, in his humor, which people have told me is very Argentinian.
Oh, that's very Argentinian.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The more they love you, the more insults you're going to hear.
Right.
So one of Pope Francis' most memorable ways of describing the church was as a field hospital.
Yeah.
Now, unpack that a little bit for us. What do you think he meant by that, and how do you see that in his papacy?
Yeah. I always liked that. That was that interview we did very early on. It was reprinted, I think, in America magazine over here. I like it for a lot of reasons. One is the church as a place of healing right at the place where the wounds are being endured. So not the hospital set back a long way away, but right there at the battlefield, the field hospital. He wants the church that goes out from the sacristies and goes into the places of suffering to bring healing. But secondly, I think this is often overlooked. A field hospital is not where you're treated for like an ingrown toenail. I mean, a field hospital is where you're being treated for massively dangerous wounds. I think he knew there were a lot of walking wounded in our culture, especially in the West, our postmodern culture. Mind you, he talked about going to the margins famously, but not just the economic margins. He meant, as he said, the existential margins. Mm-hmm. Those who are alienated from the church, alienated from meaning and purpose, and who are the walking wounded accordingly. That's where the church needs to go. And, I always took, Matt, comfort. Word on Fire, that was our inspiration, was to go out to the existential margins, is to use the media that are now giving us access to that world in a way we did not have, and to bring the gospel to people who are indeed very wounded. So I've always liked that image.
That's right, and not reducing care for the poor, just the material poor.
Not just the material poor,
yeah.
right.
So another one of Francis' ongoing priorities was to prophetically call both the church and the world to avoid embodying what he described as a throwaway culture, and to resist adopting a technocratic paradigm, or as he also put it, a technocratic mentality. What did he mean by that?
I like all that. That's all from Laudato Si. And Laudato Si, I think, is a very important document, and it's written off by its critics as, that's the global warming, letter. That's the Pope who's just kind of a Euro-left environmentalist. That's not fair to that letter. I mean, you quarrel with it, as I do, quarrel parts of it. At one point in Laudato Si, he mentions mangrove swamps. And I thought, I don't know if we have to get into literally the weeds that much in a papal... Anyway, but it's a document I respect a lot because the technocratic paradigm, he's going after modernity there. Go back to Descartes and Bacon, people like that. Descartes says we have to use our minds to master nature. Aristotle begins with the contemplation of nature. That's a whole different attitude than master nature. Francis Bacon says put nature on the rack and make it give up its secrets. Okay, it's a little aggressive, And what it gave rise to, he thought, was an anthropocentric, very human-centered, technocratic. I'm going to use technology to dominate nature so I can live longer and more comfortably. Okay, now he's not bad-mouthing technology and modern medicine, all that's great. But the attitude that can come to dominate, that we don't respect nature, we're not part of nature. It's not recognized as part of God's good creation, but something for us simply to dominate. That's a serious problem. And there, he does indeed go back pre-modern to people like Francis of Assisi.
That's right. Yeah.
People like St. Thomas Aquinas, clearly, and the Bible, which has a very strong sense of, I'm not going to call it environmentalism, I'm going to call it a keen sense of God's salvific purpose for all of creation. Right.
Yeah.
I think that's what comes through most strongly in that letter, and it's really worth reading in our time.
And it's important, as you emphasize, that it's not the secular left environmentalism.
Right. No, and I think it maybe was co-opted, and maybe there are sections of it that kind of have that overtone, but I resist that. The guy that influenced him there, I know this for sure, is Romano Guardini. Mm-hmm. So the young Bergoglio, he wasn't exactly young, I think he was early 40s. He went over for doctoral studies, never finished them. I know why, he was too old. You can't begin doctoral studies when you're 40. You can't. You got to start it when you're young enough to be able to read and concentrate. I find this very touching or poignant. They say that when he was over there, he was so homesick that he would go to the airport. I don't know where he lived, but one of the big airports, and he'd watch the planes leaving for South America.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so he was too old. But anyway, he went to study Romano Guardini. And Guardini, read his wonderful letters from Lake Como, written back in the 1920s. And that's exactly what Guardini is saying, is when he was a young guy going to Lake Como, he noticed how the buildings were very much in rhythm with nature. They weren't invasive. That even the boats that plied the waves on Lake Como were built out of kind of respect for the water. And what he noticed was, with the emergence of this sort of technocratic paradigm, the buildings were much more aggressively on the land, that the boats were kind of slicing through the water. Read Guardini for the details, but I think that's what influenced Bergoglio. And you see it. It's Guardini for our time, is Laudato Si.
Another moment in his, or turn of phrase that brought him a lot of criticism is that he just said we have to understand private property in relationship to the principle of the universal destination of goods. And there were some who said, that's Marxism.
Yeah,
but you're saying, you said, no, it's Thomism.
Right? And he's very misunderstood there. There's a Marxist way to handle those questions, but that's not what he's doing there. The principle, as articulated by Thomas Aquinas, is we have a right to private ownership. And the church has always said that. We're not against private property. That's why the church doesn't like socialism or communism. We have a right to private property, private ownership. But in the use of what we own, our primary concern must be the common good. And see, the universal destination of goods means the world belongs finally to God.
Right.
It comes from God. It's destined to return to God. We borrow it, or we are stewards of it, if you want to put it that way. But like how the hubris to say, like, okay, now I've spent this money, so now I own this property. Well, I mean, you're going to come and go.
Yeah, right.
Like, I own this mountain. I mean, give me a break. The mountain's there eons before you, or it'll be there eons after you're long gone. What do you mean you own it? No, it's okay to talk about private ownership, but the use of what we own, it was Leo XIII, who, I quote this all the time, said, once the demands of necessity and propriety have been met in your own life, so think of a father caring for his family.
Right,
The needs, and it go beyond just need, but propriety, and that's a matter of prudential judgment, But once that's been met, Leo said, the rest of what you own belongs to the poor. That's the universal destination of goods. What Francis did was he extrapolated from the individual to the national level to say that rich nations, yes, have a right to their own, property and economic goods and to protect their borders and all those things that we've talked about. Yes, but a rich nation is also concerned properly for the common good and therefore has an obligation toward poorer nations. Well, for that teaching, he was indeed excoriated as a Marxist, but that's right out of Thomas Aquinas.
And we see how the conception of the common good really does not fit into the right-left paradigm, the political paradigms.
Right, and that's something we bring, I think, as Catholics to the conversation.
Well, let's now turn to comparing Pope Francis to his immediate predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI. As I'm sure you've heard, a narrative has developed primarily within the secular media, but not only there, that the right way to understand the two popes in relationship to each other goes something like this. Pope Benedict was a man of ideas, Pope Francis a man of action. Pope Benedict was mostly interested in God's justice. Pope Francis advocated for God's mercy. Benedict was mostly concerned with engaging Europe and other centers of political and economic power in the world. Pope Francis cared more about the political and economic margins. And finally, while Pope Benedict reveled in the material and ceremonial fanfare of the papacy, Pope Francis eschewed those frivolities to live much more humbly. Do you think this is an accurate or fair characterization comparing the two of them?
No, and I'll tell you, my example is that movie, The Two Popes, which came out. I had an advanced screening of that when I was in California, and look, it's a movie I admire in many ways. The acting, the great Anthony Hopkins, and what's the other guy that plays Francis? I forgot his name now. The great English actor, Jonathan Pryce, I think. And the settings and all that. It's fun to watch. I'd watch it again just for the joy of that. But I remember sitting in the theater going like, no, oh, come on. I was, because I was with just a handful of other people. Because it was so unfair to Benedict.
Yeah.
It was fair enough to Francis, I thought, and it gave kind of the backstory of Francis and all that. But Ratzinger was reduced to a crude cipher, to a crude caricature. And he had no sense of one of the most sophisticated intellectuals, but also one of the great spiritual figures of the last 100 years. And you got this impression of this poor broken down old man that lost his faith and needed, Bergoglio to rouse him back to faith again. Come on. So no, I know that's appealing to the movie makers and to people that love to play it's not this, it's that game. Yeah, and that's stupid. Catholicism is typically a both and. Now, as you were going through those things, I'm thinking, to some degree, some of that's right. Benedict was very concerned about the conversion of Europe. He was very concerned about it. Francis, probably less so. I think that's fair that he was more focused on the margins. But some of the other ones, as you were running, I'm thinking, no. They're way too simplistic. Look at Benedict's first encyclical. It's called Deus Caritas Est. God is love. And to say that, he's just concerned with justice. No, he's a great prophet of the divine love. You know. And John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis, they all talked about the divine mercy a lot. I'll tell you, I was in Rome a couple times during the Benedict years as a scholar in residence. And whenever I could, I made it a point to go down to the square on Wednesdays to hear Benedict. Because I thought, he's like a doctor of the church, and I want to make sure I hear him. Do you want to know what word I think was most characteristic of Benedict XVI was gioia in Italian. Joy. That's the word he said over and over and over again. The Christian life is about joy. No. So to see him as this kind of, arid, Teutonic intellectual that was just hung up on doctrine and so on. The question of of simplicity versus, liturgical finery. Yeah, I think Benedict, sure, was happier to use things like the little papal hats and the mosettas and that sort of thing. But he was not a man of like personal vanity at all.
Yeah, right.
I mean, anyone that knew him as a person of great simplicity of life. Is there a legitimate role to be played in the church in a liturgical setting, to give glory to God and to heighten people's sensibility to the transcendent? That's what those things are meant to do. Like anything else, they can be overdone and they become excessive. Of course, they can. But I never sensed that in Benedict you had like this guy that was preoccupied with his appearance. And no, he was sensitive to the way the liturgy honors God and how these things elevate people's consciousness. Francis had a different approach. I'll tell you about Francis, though, because a number of times I was there when he was celebrating the Mass. And he had a very austere liturgical style. It wasn't like the church I grew up in of like, hey, everybody, good morning, how you doing? And there was none of that with Francis. He was very Jesuit, I think, very kind of subdued and focused. And he was very reverent, a very reverent approach to the liturgy. So all those caricatures, they catch some truth here and there, but they largely miss it.
Well, before turning to looking towards the future, based on what we have in Francis' legacy, you have expressed some charitable criticisms of Francis' papacy, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to express some of those concerns and
Sure.
and what you found troubling about them.
Well, I mean, one thing I'd say is he was a rhetorically gifted man, not in the refined manner of like a John Paul II or Benedict. He was rhetorically gifted in the manner of a parish priest giving a homily at morning mass. He was very good at that kind of off-the-cuff rhetoric. He had a very colorful way of speaking. But a danger of that, I thought, was a certain lack of refinement at times, where he would fall into the it's not this, it's that approach to things. A tendency for either or black and white thinking as opposed to the very Catholic both and. And whenever I catch him saying, not like this, I go, oh, God. No, usually it's like this and like that. And we have to kind of find a balance.
Right.
So I quarrel at times with that. And make that a little more specific. His targets so often were conservative Catholics. And, look, Francis, to his great credit, he didn't change any doctrines. That was a great concern that conservatives had over the years. Like, oh, he's going to change. Name one doctrine Francis changed. Nothing. Moral doctrine, the great liberal desire. Let's have married priests. Let's have end of celibacy. Let's have women priests. Let's have loosening of sexual morality, abortion, transgenderism. Nothing. Yeah. He gave on nothing of that. The great Catholic collapse before the culture didn't happen on his watch. Okay. But that's why I find it puzzling in a way that he was so tough on conservative Catholics. And they were the object often of his sharpest kind of rhetorical rebukes. I remember one time, I think it was the first round of the Synod on synodality, he rarely spoke, to his credit, because he knew that if he spoke as the Pope would kind of end the conversation. So usually he didn't speak. But one time he asked to speak to the entire gathering. Here's 400 cardinals, archbishops, all over the world, some of the leading people in the church. What he talked about was the young seminarians and priests who were spending too much time at Gamarelli's, which is this haberdashery shop in Rome where you buy hats and collars and stuff. Well, okay, I'm sure there are some young priests and seminaries who are too preoccupied with all the, foo-foo stuff. But I remember at the time thinking, that's what the successor of Peter wants to talk to the leaders of the international church about.
Yeah.
It just struck me as disproportionate. Like there was a almost preoccupation with the conservative, the rigid, especially young. And I know for sure, I deal a lot with young seminarians and priests, that they were put off by that. They were hurt by that. Remember the remark about little monsters, that the seminaries are producing little monsters.
Yeah.
And they heard that. Believe me, they heard that. So that's a critique I've had of Francis, that I thought he was way too tough on conservative Catholics. And even though, he didn't undermine the Orthodox teaching of the church, but he was tough on conservatives.
What do you think of his perception of the American church? He seemed to have a very view of the church that he was certain was in line with the
Yeah.
sort of conservative Catholicism you're describing, but it's just was far off from the reality.
I don't think he knew it very well,
Yeah.
honestly. This goes back, Cardinal George, who was my great mentor, died not long after Francis was elected. Francis George died in 2015, so he was like, well, that's 2 years into Francis' reign. And at one time, I remember at the table, he said, he seems to think we, meaning the American leadership, he seems to think that we're just businessmen. This view of like these capitalist Americans preoccupied with money and the cardinal, he wasn't angry. He had this puzzled look like, where's that coming from? And doesn't he know, in fact, it's a pretty vibrant church, and there's a lot of life in the American church, especially among young people.
Right.
And he must have known too that, let's face it, the more living parts of the church are the more orthodox ones. You look at the Church of Germany or other countries in Western Europe where a liberal Catholic model has come to hold sway. They're dying on the vine, I used to say at the Synod, I said it many times, why are we preoccupied with the German church? Why don't we look to the Nigerian church, which is flourishing in every way? 94% of Catholics go to Mass on Sunday, seminaries bursting, evangelization proceeding apace. Why aren't we looking to the Nigerians saying, hey, what are you doing right here? So there was this kind of preoccupation, I thought, with the Western, liberal sort of model, when in fact the American church had lots of signs of life in it. So yeah, I sensed that, with him, and it bugged a lot of us. We thought, he doesn't really understand the American church that well. He came precisely once to visit, and I remember he said on that trip how surprised he was at the crowds that received him. And we're like, why would you be surprised?
Exactly.
You're the Pope. This is a vibrantly Catholic community. Of course they're going to come out in great numbers. So the fact that he was surprised by that, we thought was surprising.
And there's nothing wrong with having an entrepreneurial spirit within the church, right? I mean, coming from Word on Fire, there's many groups that have been founded here that are doing great work that do embrace that kind of spirit of creation.
Right. And, and I also understand that there were some wealthy Catholics in our country, that were a little reluctant to be giving a lot of money when the Pope was so kind of relentlessly critical of like American capitalism and so on. It deserves critique, as we were saying earlier. Of course it does. But yeah, there was, I think, and I would say born of the South American experience, a certain suspicion of the U.S.
Well, before we turn to our listener question, to draw our conversation to a conclusion here, what do you think from Francis's legacy is something we should preserve moving forward?
A lot. I think the church that goes out from itself, which I think is right out of Vatican II. It's Lumen Gentium. It's Paul VI. It's John Paul II. It's Benedict. He continued. I heard with my own little ears at the Ad Limina visit with the California bishops when he said, the key to my papacy is Evangelii Gaudium, right? The joy of the gospel. His letter, cleverly titled, by the way, it's combined Evangelii Nunciandi of Paul VI with Gaudium et Spes of Vatican II. Evangelii Gaudium. And he said, that's the key to my papacy. Good. I think it puts him right in line with his predecessors. Also, I would say, Matt, he's the Pope of mercy. The fact that his favorite word was misericordia. Misericordia, mercy, mercy. If John Paul called us to heroic sanctity, which he did, he himself was a saint, and he was a hero, and he called us appropriately to be heroes of the faith. Good. But, and I saw this firsthand in seminary work, what do you do when you can't live up to that? And that's all of us sinners, right? You can't live up to that. You need the field hospital. You need the healing balm of Christ. You need the word of mercy. And I think that's how I read like John Paul and Francis together.
It's now time for our listener question. Today we have John from London asking about how to deal with regret from the past, especially in our older years.
Dear Bishop Barron, my name is John from London. As an older person, how does one come to terms with regret for mistakes and decisions which cannot be changed? How can one look forward rather than beating oneself up all the time? Thank you for Word on Fire.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I don't know precisely what kind of regret you're talking about, but one great grace we have in the Catholic Church is confession. And so we've done something in the past that we regret, confess it before the Lord, and then let go of it. It's not right. Once you've confessed something, you've been forgiven for it, it's not right to hang on to it. and allow the Lord just to heal you and allow you to let go of the past. So I would say take advantage of the sacrament of reconciliation and seek, forgiveness for something in the past, and then let go of it. God's always interested in what's coming, interested in our future. He doesn't want us held captive to the past. And take advantage of the sacrament for that.
Well, thanks so much, John, for reaching out to us. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. As always, we really love to hear from you. All right, Bishop, we're at the end of the conversation. Another excellent one. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Matt.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. See you next time.